Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Steve Myers, Managing Editor here at Digital Health Insights in CHIME, and today's presentation is Revolutionizing Healthcare Cybersecurity, Innovation for a Safer Future. Today's webinar is sponsored by Cynerio, and we'll have a panel format, so we're going to have a panel discussion. Feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function. At any time, we may field questions during the discussion, and we'll try to field as many questions as we can, time permitting at the end. Just one quick note before we get started. We have an all-star panel for you today, so you won't want to miss a word, but if you do, rest assured that this webinar will be available on demand shortly after it closes. Look for an email from us giving you access to that on-demand version tomorrow. You should receive that. So let me introduce our all-star panel. We have our own Russ Branzell, CEO and President of CHIME and its affiliate associations. Prior to joining CHIME in 2013, Russ served as CEO of the Colorado Health Medical Group and held an impressive variety of innovation and management roles throughout the healthcare industry. He served on active duty in the United States Air Force and retired from the Air Force Reserves in 2008. Also with us is Andrew Carney, who joined ARPA-H in July 2023 from HSBC's Cybersecurity Science and Analytics Group, where he worked as a principal researcher. He has over 15 years of experience in software and hardware vulnerability research, technical education and training, and management of research and development teams. And next we have Daniel Brodie, who is co-founder and CTO of Cynerio. Daniel's background in application and operating system security, combined with vulnerability discovery and experience in Israel's Unit 8200 cyber technology division, are the foundation upon which Cynerio's healthcare dedicated research and development efforts are built. Leading the discussion today and moderating the webinar is Chad Holmes. From call center software to military logistics systems, Chad has spent 20 years helping create, break, and secure a variety of technologies, while helping others learn to do the same. In his role as Cynerio's security evangelist, Chad helps educate healthcare providers on the threats introduced by Internet of Things, OT, and medical IoT devices throughout their organizations. So I'm going to hand things off to Chad to get us started with this wonderful discussion on cybersecurity. Chad, it's all yours.
Great. Steve, thank you for the introduction. Russ, Daniel, and Andrew, thank you for joining me today. Folks, I'm really excited to have these three panelists today, simply because innovation is such a big field, particularly in healthcare cybersecurity, that having a bunch of different angles is really valuable. The angles today are particularly interesting because we have folks that have been in innovation for 20 years, particularly Russ and his work with CHIME in particular, folks that are innovating today, Daniel and his team, and then people that are enabling the future of innovation in terms of Andrew and the great work that Andrew's doing at ARPA-H. So as we go through, please feel free to ask questions. We're going to hit as many topics as we possibly can. It's a very wide range of topics. But if you have a question, put it in there. I'll do my best to get it to it in real time. If we can't, no big deal. We'll get it to at the end. So with that, let's jump right in. Before we start talking about innovations and how we have to protect healthcare, it's always important to actually start talking about what we're trying to protect and what the problem actually is. So Russ, I'm going to start with you on this one. When you're talking to your peers, your colleagues, your CHIME members, there can be some frustration, sometimes skepticism around how bad are attacks really? What should we really be protecting? So as you're going through, what anecdotes, stats, examples do you provide to really paint the picture of how bad the attacks are and what we really need to defend against?
Well, I'll say it this way because it makes it a little overly simple. Everything all the time is under attack in healthcare now. And I don't think that is really an underestimation of what they're doing right now. I'm on the board for technology for a health system here in the greater Atlanta area, and we get very detailed reports of the attack surface that is coming right now. And it is pervasive. It is nonstop. And they have to protect for every single one, and the bad guys only have to get in once. And I think if you think about the ecosystem of healthcare now, which is everything is connected, we've worked so hard for 20 years to create a connected ecosystem which means now we're a connected ecosystem, which means we're totally vulnerable together, no matter where we're connected. So beauty of what we've done with all the information flowing together in a seamless way for the most part is we also now have a security vulnerability that's pervasive to everyone all the time. All you have to do is look at the recent Change Healthcare. And again, we don't blame them, but at the exact same time, it's just one more vulnerability outside of our control, but yet we're responsible and accountable for. So I think the healthcare ecosystem is feeling the full brunt of the cyber environment at this point.
Yeah, and I jotted down totally vulnerable together. I think that's a great way to put it out there because change not only shows that, but we have to share the experiences that we're having. If you look at University of Vermont and what they did a couple of years ago, when they were breached, they didn't just kind of hide and say, "Oh no, it was bad." They came out and educated everyone. So we are in this together. Daniel, I'm going to toss it over to you. I know Change Healthcare is top of mind. What other examples or anecdotes do you share to kind of paint the picture of how bad this really is?
So the one I like to refer back to at that IBM research where they talked about how it on average in the healthcare it takes more than 200 days for a healthcare organization to detect an attack on their network, and almost 2.5 months, about I think it was 73 days, to remediate and respond to that attack. And I think that is pervasive of the state of adding on to what Russ mentioned about how we're all vulnerable together. And also when something happens, right? It's not a question of if you'll be attacked, but when. And then the question is when you'll be attacked. The current state is sadly, you'll know about it way too late, and it will take you way too long to respond to it. And I think that's changing, and I think there's improvement happening, and a lot of processes that are causing things to get better. But there's still an uphill battle to happen around that.
Cool. And if I did my math there correctly, it takes roughly as long to make a baby as it does to fully execute a cyber attack. So if we think of it in that terms, that is a long attack that happens. Andrew, same question to you. You're in an interesting role because the federal government has recognized that healthcare is critical infrastructure and needs additional funding and efforts to help protect it. As you're trying to paint that picture, what stats or anecdotes do you share with your colleagues? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. And the first one, achievement unlocked. I think a lot about the window of vulnerability when we look at the sort of software ecosystem that we're dealing with. And when we've looked previously at large open source projects, and the XZ issue very much top of mind right now, for latent vulnerabilities, we're talking about years. I think the MITRE paper from a few years ago talked about 4+ years of existence in the code base before it was discovered or accidentally patched. So even if it wasn't actually discovered, it was just sort of the patch happened to take care of it. And that's a really long time, especially when you combine the sort of long-livedness of a lot of the technology in the healthcare space. So it's exacerbating that already kind of problematic issue.
Yeah, and the accidental patch issue is interesting because if you look at issues like Log4j even, Veracode, a former employer of mine, did a study, and it's something like 32 or 38% of Log4j issues, which are known and awful and have been out there for 2 years, are still open. And I would actually guess it'd be higher within healthcare. So accidental patching is great. It's not a strategy, but we have to really focus on securing the issues we have. So we know that attacks are out there and we know what they're happening. The next obvious question is why? What are the motives behind these attacks? And Daniel, I want to start with you. Our kind of lizard brains say, oh no, it's a horror movie where they're going to come in and they're going to try to kill me with an IV pump while I'm getting care. Is that what attackers are after, or do they have other motives?
So I think at the end of the day, it feels a little bit cold-hearted and sad to say this, but that's the reality. Ransomware attackers operate like a business. They have a payout they're looking to achieve. They have a work and effort, kind of a cost of salary that it costs them to kind of put in that work and effort to make sure they get to that payoff that they want to get to. And they want to get to the easiest payoff they can get with the least amount of work, right? That's what it is about at the end of it. It's a numbers game. And sadly, healthcare is in a situation where from that perspective, there's a low amount of effort and there is a high ability to get a payoff, whether it's due to patient confidentiality issues of EPHI and its value in the dark web and so forth, or whether it's even just an availability issue. Right? We know we have a rough understanding of how costly the Change Healthcare attack is to the industry, and that's a strong driver of the cost that organizations are willing to pay to not have to suffer those costs. So you combine those two things together, and that is a again, I'm sorry to use these terms, but a product market fit for ransomware attackers, right, is in the healthcare vertical.
Yeah, and Andrew, I'll go to you on this as well, because there is a product market fit. This is a very, very valuable industry for hackers. Are they only focused on profit, or do they have other motivations? Andrew, that one's for you. Are there other motivations? Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I think regardless of the motivations, the idea that we're dealing with nation state level capabilities is very clear, right? So the commercialization of that level of technology and that being used offensively with very little concern for the collateral damage that the attacks are having is that doesn't feel great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's terrifying. And it brings us to a really interesting comment that I heard. And Russ, I'm going to ask you this. I was talking to a CIO about a year and a half ago, or CISO, I should say, excuse me. And he said his approach to ransomware was never pay the ransom, but always be prepared to do so. Do you think that's still valuable guidance? Do you think that will actually stop the attacks going forward?
Well, I would never give advice on an organization's risk management strategy, to say the least. So I'll genericize this and say every organization's got to go through a risk management, but more importantly, they've got to understand what the other side of a hack, a ransomware, anything really needs to be. To be proactive is to be ready to be reactive at the exact same time. And I think these organizations need to understand, who have worked with local law enforcement, to have worked with their cyber consultants, everything, to say, in any given scenario, what is our probable outcome, and are we ready to execute that on a very quick basis? Is it to retake our backup tapes and our backup systems real quick and be able to reconstitute ourselves in a very quick fashion? Well, that may change, again, the way we operate from a technology perspective. It may be very well, because of your size, complexity, and risk appetite, that part of this is you don't have any other choice but to pay the ransom, which means in the world of extremes, you've got to determine in which part of those guardrails of the extremes you're willing to operate in. And in some cases, it literally is the extremes, which is up to and including I can't even operate and I need to outsource everything I'm doing to a provider because I am incapable of or collecting the technical and or human capital expertise to be able to run these kind of operations right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even if they do pay the ransom, there's no guarantee of restoration or services, or it could get really messy. We don't mean to pick on Change because there's plenty of examples out there, but Change appears to have paid a $22 million ransom, which started two hacking groups fighting with each other. So, and Change is still having issues. So just paying the ransom doesn't necessarily restore services, but in some cases, people have had luck there. So it's a really hard decision to make. Russ, I want to stick with you because we're going to get to one of the real big issues here, which is the financial factor. HDOs already invest fortunes, right, in traditional cyber protections. They've been told you have to put up firewalls and NACs and the variety of other systems to help protect their environments. But those protections are no longer sufficient. To your point earlier, we spent 20 years getting everything online, and now everything is vulnerable. So we're going to get into budgets a little bit later on, but at a high level, what budgetary recommendations do you give to colleagues as they're starting to explore new protections and finding the money for them?
Well, I think we've worked backwards on this for a long time. We've tried to build the justification from the technology cybersecurity side up in a traditional organizational prioritization model. It's probably the wrong model. What we need to be thinking is a risk appetite and a risk assurance perspective from a governance from the top down, and what budget is necessary to support that. It's as great as the CISOs and CIOs and CDOs are out there in the world. Their job is to educate and to get an organizational level of understanding, a governance of what risk modeling they're willing to accept. And if it's a certain X, whatever that is, then what budgetary requirement comes with that? Because that fiduciary responsibility of assuming that risk is not the CISOs or the CIOs or CTOs, it's the board governance in those organizations, at least in the US marketplace. And the other places in the world, it's a different model. But if they assume this, but yet don't fund it, then that's their issue from that perspective. You can't really hold the CISO responsible for a breach if everyone knew something was going to occur or could occur, but didn't come up with the financial model. And we'll talk more about budgets, and we have some very specific numbers on that. But the reality is a bottom-up budgetary approach will never get the resources necessary most of the time. I shouldn't overgeneralize. In normal cases, will not get you the budgetary resources necessary to put a risk modeled security front up to protect yourselves.
Right. If we take the top 3% of hospitals that are well funded out of the equation, then that's absolutely right. So great point there. Andrew, I want to jump to the other side of the financial discussion with you, because when we drive down the highways, we see big orange signs that say your tax dollars at work, right? We're fixing the bridge, we're fixing this. ARPA-H with DigiHeals is doing something really interesting where we're taking some of those tax dollars and investing in healthcare. So could you tell everyone just a little bit about DigiHeals and how some of our tax dollars are helping to fight these cyber attacks?
Absolutely. So ARPA-H's mission as an agency is to accelerate better health outcomes for everyone. And one of the ways, I mean, we have to have our healthcare infrastructure up to do that. And so DigiHeals recognized that there was a lot of technology from the defense space that we had used in more kind of bespoke mission contexts. And if we could generalize it, if we could make it sort of not necessarily commercially viable, but more useful at scale or across a wide, that there would be potential benefits for our sort of healthcare resilience as a nation. I think a couple of and those efforts are public on our website at arpah.gov, the currently funded ones. And you can see, I mean, one of them right now is looking forward as regarding SBOM. So there's obviously been a lot of work, both from a policy perspective and a tech perspective, on the value, utility, and sort of like application of different SBOM flavored things. And one of the really interesting things that this particular performer is doing is translating SBOM kind of flavored discoveries using static analysis into natural language descriptions of program functionality. So the idea that you could have someone with minimal to no actual like software development or even security background necessarily be reading the functionality of a piece of code and potentially, you know, identifying, well, there was a patch, they changed these things. Do these things make sense? And right now that work is still, you know, crawling. But I think it's really interesting, the idea that if we present more information about the artifacts that everyone's using in just a more scrutable fashion, that we sort of get the network effect, we get more eyes on the underlying tech. So I think that's very exciting for me.
Yeah, and for anyone not familiar, SBOM is software bill of materials. The best way to explain it is there is no one piece of technology that is just what it looks like. If we think of an IV pump, and IV pumps are notoriously vulnerable, they're all through hospitals. That IV pump has everything from the outer shell to the silicone chips and everything in between. SBOM will tell you all the components within the software of that, and that's really valuable for doing better analysis. Which brings us into the next subject, which is really interesting, which is we have 3 phases of innovation represented on today's call. With Andrew and DigiHeals, they're looking down the road, 3-5 years down the road, on what's going to really help the industry as a whole. But we also have examples of recent adoptions kind of over the last 3 years or so, as well as new protections coming out. So Russ, I'd like you to start a little bit. What have you seen change in the last 3 years that's really helped expand protections in healthcare, that if you don't have them, you should be looking at them today?
Yeah, it's interesting because it was not that long ago that I was a CIO, and as long as we had passwords being managed for the clinicians and for most of the people in our health system, we thought we were secure. And now you look at it as out there, and you almost have to take a best right now, kind of a best of breed security perspective as you try to really look at the entire infrastructure of your security platform. And that's much different than what we've seen in the past. We've been cherry picking solutions as we've identified vulnerabilities. Now what you're seeing is really good organizations, really good CISOs, building kind of a mindset of a security platform that really covers just about everywhere, whether that be IoT security, whether that be endpoint and endpoint detections. You'll see an entire kind of mindset of zero trust security, which is really interesting because that's one of those ones that I always ask questions on, whether I'm on a board and others, and say, tell me what zero trust security means. And pretty much I'll get a different answer from every person, which means it's something, but we're trying to figure out still what it is. I think the part that I've seen recently that is really interesting, and I think it's one that both creates a massive opportunity, especially for the medium and small organizations, physician office players, but yet at the same time also creates a massive vulnerability for the industry, is essentially cloud computing. which in some ways is really offshoring and or outsourcing your security at the same time. The thought process until fairly recently was you're probably far better off from a security perspective, letting one of the big guys handle it, one of the big companies handle this. I think recently we have proven that maybe not to be as accurate as, I still think it's probably more secure for the medium and small organizations that can't afford the infrastructure out there. I think the other part of this that's starting to emerge, and we'll talk more about that as the other two gentlemen speak, is really the emergence of those things where we start doing threat intelligence. We start doing proactive monitoring. We start looking for anomaly management out there. And you'll start seeing this occur all over the place. Even the concept of identity management, which used to be fairly simplistic, now has its own entire infrastructure with dozens and dozens components underneath something called identity management. It used to be identity management, which is, do I have the right person? They have access to the right apps. I mean, that was generally what we said. Now we're really doing monitoring of what that person's accessing, how they're accessing, and what it goes on. And I think the part that unfortunately is becoming a much greater prevalent technology, if not really kind of orientation for organizations, is really incident response. It really is in every single organization now. They have to be ready at a moment's notice to at least respond to a threat or really, unfortunately, an incident. And so I give great credit to the gains we've made in this industry in cyber, really in the last 5 years. Just prior to COVID is when I would say we really started ramping up our security presence to the area it is. But as you listen to the two other gentlemen, we've got a lot of opportunities still to continue.
Yeah, and I think the incident response is interesting because it's very easy for cybersecurity folks to get into the theoretical. What should we be doing at a theoretical level and locking down everything? In reality, we have to take a very practical approach to doing things like detecting an attack and responding to it quickly, right? And so, Daniel, I think this leads nicely into what you're doing, right? Where Russ has seen everything up to this point and continues to lead the industry there. Andrew's investing down the road and helping companies grow. You and your team, that I'm happy to be a part of, so thank you, but your team continues to build technologies that are rolling out day by day in some cases to actually help improve protections immediately. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of cutting edge technology that's rolling out and what you're seeing be real effective?
Yeah, and by the way, thank you, Russ, for that great coverage, because I do think that speaks a lot to, as you mentioned, how the industry has moved forward. And I think there are quite a lot of organizations who are different places on the spectrum. And I think in that sense, I think what you mentioned, which I think is critical and is happening more and more, is the platform piece, right? Organizations moving away from getting small technologies to cover small pieces of the problems they're trying to solve, and moving towards really wider solutions, whether it's hooking them up internally and figuring out internally how they connect multiple solutions, or whether it's getting solutions that cover a wider spectrum of their network. But definitely that is something that we've seen being very successful and very helpful in organizations to reducing the amount of work and time and manpower needed to allow them to handle the great challenges that they have in front of them. And the second piece, which again, Russ, you mentioned, and I'll just repeat it, is that attack detection response piece, that being able to handle that threat intelligence that's coming in, and that really is a significant helper, especially for those medium organizations. They might have a harder time rolling out those zero trust policies. They might have a harder time kicking off those big projects and budgeting for them. And we really see that being the place that customers get the most bang for their buck, because at the end of the day, to be completely protected from all the different pieces, whether it's identity, whether it's network access, whether it's device risk or laptop risk or emails and phishing, it's a tremendous job, and a lot of organizations still have a lot of work to do there. And you want to really make sure that you have that first line of defense, which helps organization make sure that it's not just about deploying the technology, it's also about knowing what you do once you've deployed that technology, right? How do you make sure that once you've had an attack on your network, you're responding to it in a way that's quick enough to remediate it? And the last piece that I do want to mention, and I think this is something we're seeing a stronger trend in healthcare, is also not just looking at it from the standard IT side of things, right? Whether it's endpoint and laptops and cloud and whatever it is, but also looking at it from that healthcare perspective. And that's things like a proper EPHI data protection, which is, again, something we've also been looking at and we've working with customers on, but having an understanding of where the EPHI sits in the organization, having a better understanding of the healthcare specific vendor accesses that are happening in healthcare. And that's a lot of things that traditional IT solutions are not helping the healthcare industry understand their unique and specific risks.
Yeah, and Daniel, I'll brag a little bit on your behalf because there are a couple things that your research team has rolled out recently. One with the NDR, attack detection response, or network detection response. As you mentioned, we have a lot of examples of attacks there, so that's a full-fledged product that we have. We also have, as you were just mentioning, patient data security, where because data is unencrypted in transit, you can actually identify where it's exposed to the outside world relatively easy if you know what to look for. So if anyone's worried about those two things, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to put you in touch with Daniel and team and educate you on kind of how we can stop those attacks. Daniel, I want to stick with you for a little bit because all too often we're telling leaders that they have to do more, they have to secure more, they have to buy more, but the actual guidance on what more looks like can be really challenging. And that's why when the ARPA-H cybersecurity performance goals came out a couple months ago, I was personally really excited. I think you were really happy about them too, because they talked about the essential goals, what everyone should be doing, and the enhanced goals, what everyone should be researching and adopting as soon as possible. So I'd like to get your opinion. What were your first thoughts when you saw those goals, and are there any other goals or guidance that people should be looking at?
So I think the essential goals are critical. Like you said, I was very happy to see that there's actual discussion happening in the healthcare industry about what are the things that should be rolling out. I think the essentials are exactly that. They're essentials. The things are really the stuff that are the basics. And it was also very nice to see that it's not only about part of the goals was having the right processes and ownership in the around like some of the stuff that I mentioned around how to and Russ mentioned how to respond to an attack. So that I think was very nice to see in those goals. I think that one of the big takeaways I think is critical for communicating there is that the enhanced goals, they're not like a nice to have extra credit. They are definitely something that are essential to have, just like you might not have all of them with 100% coverage now, and that's okay. And it's important to understand how you get to a place where you can have them and to kind of work understand how you get to a place where you have as many of those covered as possible. So they're really not extra credit. It's really just something that's more like you should start talking with vendors, talking internally, talking with people who are knowledgeable in the industry to understand how to take those additional pieces and build out a roadmap for your future to make sure you're covering all those pieces and most importantly, prioritizing amongst them.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to dive deeper, Daniel and I did a webinar with Amazon and Sodexo a couple of weeks ago as well that dives much deeper into those, and I'm happy to pass that along. Andrew, I want to come to you next because there are other not goals, but guidance that are out there like CISA.gov, right? So when you're talking to folks in the space, what other recommendations do you have around goals or guidance they should look into?
I think generally there's one of the big challenges is finding the right fit. And one of the things that, since coming into healthcare, that I continue to be kind of in the face by is how different every facility, every system kind of runs and operates. Even if they have even if our goals are all similar and we're wanting to achieve the same thing, that achieving successful deployment and doing so in a way that does not add any friction to the lives of clinicians or staff in any way, shape, or form, that seems like a tremendous. We can get to we can achieve the security elements potentially doing so in a manner that does not increase the burden on staff. That's another challenge that I think I know is top of mind for lots of folks, but maybe isn't explicitly called out enough in the security space. I don't think it should be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Russ, I have to go to you because you have lived for years now trying to find what to do next and what to recommend next. So as you're talking to CIOs and CISOs today, what recommendations do you have for where they should look for guidance?
So interesting. The answer is lots of places, unfortunately. But that's probably a good thing because that means we're focusing on this at a more macro level. If you think about it, there's guidance coming out all over right now, but our 405D workforce that came out and the recommendations they made, But we also have some historic stuff that's done through the NIST guidelines, which, talk about, I think you said it earlier, your tax-paying dollars at work. NIST has done a pretty darn good job over the years of providing us resources, guidance, and direction at a macro level. Even their work with the Baldrige Cybersecurity Framework, which is taking not just the NIST standards, but creating an operating model in which you can operate in a very secure fashion. CISA has been putting resources out for years, especially for the small, medium facilities that don't have the resources of a big academic, big health system. There are natural resources that many people don't know. We actually spend a lot of time trying to let our members know there are a lot of governmental resources, whether that be in the FBI, whether that be in other entities. And you'll even see now recently, and to their credit, the FDA stepping up and putting a lot more work in place to try to help us secure a really difficult infrastructure with our medical devices that we've never had before. And our traditional play has always been with ONC. And Dr. Chapathi has done a really good job because he was a field person and he understands the pain that we're going through in these areas in trying to create a reasonable way forward for us not only to create a secure place, but also a better place to exchange information in a meaningful fashion. At the risk of tooting our own horn, we've got an amazing team in Washington at CHIME who really spends a lot of time advocating, along with other great associations like the AHA, AMA, and others who have people there as well, really trying to proactively shape legislation, guidance, and provide information. Even as of yesterday, and I hold this up just to show everybody, and I'm gonna even probably mess up the name, CIRCIA, the latest thing out of CISA, as they try to even define what an actual breach might look like, actually something that actually guidance for this. Is it perfect? Probably not. Is it an attempt at least to provide us guidance and direction and some reasonableness in an industry that often doesn't really have that? Yes. So I think we've got a lot out there and a lot of guidance. The real question is, how do you channel that into a real meaningful strategy within your organization?
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to sometimes cybersecurity is academic. We're never going to reach perfect, right? But if we start the journey today, we're going to be better off tomorrow and the next day and the next day. It brings us to an interesting question that's popped up in the Q&A, which leads in nicely to what's actually on my little cheat sheet here. But one of the core problems is that things like ransomware attacks are not reported and tracked, right? We have some numbers around them, but if you get hit by ransomware, you're not obligated to report it, which is in contrast to what actually happens with a data breach now, right? If you have a data breach of over 500 records for a healthcare provider, you have to report it and it goes on the HHS wall of shame. So I'll open this up to whoever wants to speak first. Should we start increasing regulation around ransomware attacks, how they're reported, how they're tracked, et cetera? And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I'll jump in just because I can read pretty well here. And that is the actual new requirement is all about reporting. It's actually called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, CIRCIA, and it's all about reporting requirements. And it really does go through and say what is an actual substantial cyber incident that is worthy of reporting. It breaks it down into 4 categories. Whether that's the right 4 categories, I'm going to let experts like Daniel and Andrew go through and figure out, but at least it's an attempt to start a framework where we say, hey, here's what should be reported, here's what shouldn't be reported. There's always going to be some stuff left to interpretation. I mean, for me, this is 2 days old, and I read through it. It took me about 6 times to even understand most of the words that are so technical in here, but the requirement actually makes sense that here's the things that are reasonable that we should have to report so we actually know what's going on. And I'll give one little anecdotal example. I won't say what state, I was at a state hospital association giving a little talk on what we see in our Digital Health Most Wired survey a few years ago. And I gave some statistics, and one hand went up and said, those aren't probably accurate for us because we know of at least a dozen entities in our state that have been hit, hacked, paid ransomware, dealt with it, and didn't report anything. So what we have as information is pretty accurate to the extent in which people are willing to report it. But after that, it's not.
Yeah, and by the way, the numbers that are reported, sorry, before I go to this, William asked the question that led to that discussion. So William, I hope that's a good answer in the Q&A there. Feel free to keep those questions coming. I see some comments popping up around good articles to read around this as well. So audience, good job. You're pulling your weight here. But if you look at what's actually reported, the numbers are absolutely staggering, right? We've had places that routinely see 9-figure recovery costs for ransomware attacks. We've seen cybersecurity insurance that only covers 4, 5, or 6 million when the total recovery cost is 100 million. So the reality is it's going to continue to get worse before it gets better, and we just need to accelerate that path to better. Daniel and Andrew, I'll ask you, are there any other regulatory trends or drivers we see? I know there's a lot of laws that are very slowly passing their way through Congress, but any other trends or drivers that we should talk about? And no is an okay answer there. No, okay. So we'll pass that off because we can talk more tech with you guys. Russ, I do want to stay with you because the next topic is rather interesting, which is the fiscal factors. We started to hit on it up top, but I want to dive a little bit deeper, right? Because as we're adopting these new technologies, hospitals want to spend every possible dollar on treating patients that they can, right? Every dollar not spent on a hospital can be, or on a patient can be seen as potentially wasted dollars. So going and buying newer technologies that may not be proven or set in stone can be a really, really hard thing to do. So as you're talking to people, do you have rules of thumb, guidance, strategies for finding funding for newer protections that may still be a little bit ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of stats here, and you can make a pretty broad range. Average health system in the United States spends somewhere between 3.5% and 5% of overall OpEx on IT, not on security. Then there's a fraction of that is part of the cybersecurity budget. If you do look at most other industries that are very tech intensive, major finance, major manufacturing, things like that, they're actually spending closer to 3 to 5% on cybersecurity alone. So that does tell you right out of the gate, our backs are a little against the wall, which means we can't make any mistakes whatsoever with the investments that we have. So the advice really is simple, and there's great organizations that can help you without that. But we do see this, and I happen to be the board that I'm on. They do this every single year. They go through an entire risk identification, risk assurance, and really in this case, heat mapping process that really gets you to where you should be making your priorities and what it is. So if it's a low threat but high risk, well, you go, okay, maybe I don't really need to spend as much on that, but if it's a really high risk and a really high threat and you're not doing well in that area, you better be spending some money on those areas. So really good organizations are approaching this both really strategically, but at the exact same time, very tactfully, with the right tools in place to really map to a risk mitigation process that allows them to feel like they're making the appropriate investments. There's a million technology opportunities out there. Good organizations make really good decisions with the facts that they can have in front of them, instead of just saying, hey, I saw this at a conference, it looked really cool, we should buy one of these because it looked cool in their PowerPoint presentation, rather than mapping it to a solution and a vulnerability in your organization.
Yeah, and that leads to something, Daniel, you brought up earlier, which is we're starting to see the spread of protections, not just focused on IoT, but spreading to IoT, OT, IOMT, et cetera. So as you're working with customers and colleagues, how are you working to identify how to shift that spend? Is it just, hey, you need to find more money? Or is it, hey, you're spending X amount on IT. If you do A, B, and C, that X can also cover IoT. So what are you seeing in that extension?
That's a great question. I think at the end of the day, it's similar to the mapping that Russ mentioned, right? We kind of work with the organizations. We look at their priorities, look at where they're focused on and what they're kind of being measured on, and then we help figure out how are they working to actually implement that. So if they're working to implement and say, hey, we have a solution, and we'll take something we discussed earlier, right? The network, detecting attacks on the network through attack detection response, network detection response, NDR solutions. So if you are working to have that fully implemented in your organization, you could either have one solution for IT, one solution for IoT, OT, and another solution for medical, or you could come and look at having a solution that covers everything. But they're all valid ways of doing it. The question is, you just can't just buy one solution, dump it somewhere, have nobody look at it and say, I've done that, right? You have to kind of figure out how your coverage looks like, What are you missing in the coverage? Are you also covering cloud? Are you not covering? What are the stuff that include the risk that you want to make sure you have the ability to check off, and then making sure that you have that as a complete project, and then mapping that to the priorities of the organization. Otherwise, as Russ mentioned, people just keep buying that one solution, dumping it somewhere, and then not having that risk actually mitigated, or that risk that they want to have covered actually covered. So that's kind of how we're working on it. Then it could be it's a discussion. It's whether you buy a more expensive solution that covers more, or you buy a cheaper solution but you spend more on people, or if you're bringing outside resources, maybe they cover some. Whatever it is, there's different ways to make the cake, right? To cover whatever you want to cover, but it just has to be a conscious choice.
Yeah, and Shanna in the comments said a proper assessment is absolutely essential. The good news is there's a lot of different ways to assess the technologies and their capabilities, whether they be analysts, whether it be bake-offs or whatever. So if you are looking to figure out how to bake these off, let us know, let our colleagues know. We can give you plenty of ways to do that. Andrew, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit financially, but on a different side, which is, again, the big orange billboard. The current administration has invested a lot of money in ARPA-H for a variety of things. So can you give an overview of what that funding looks like and how much is currently going to cybersecurity?
So other than the published funding, there's a lot of info on currently funded work on the ARPA-H website, and it's probably best to go there. Discussing funding specifically is, I'd rather not at the moment, just generally.
Fair enough, yeah.
I will say, and kind of echo Russ and Daniel, that the challenges, especially coming from a technology space that is focused largely on enterprise compute, right, on the systems that are most widely deployed, and then adapting those solutions into niche spaces, or just spaces that are more complex, have completely different device classes, completely, like, orders of magnitude more complexity in terms of deployment and management, and extremely high sensitivity to downtime. It's seeing that adaptation and seeing or places where that adaptation has been weaker, kind of going back to performance. I think it's very hard to gauge the value of our investments, whether we're a taxpayer, a VC, or a hospital buying a product, unless we can look at the performance of the sort of field in under different conditions. So doing like a partial deployment in your system comes with a lot of costs, right? If you're doing operational testing, doing more synthetic testing has its own challenges. But I think more work in that space generally will help us not only guide the research as we fund it, but also help folks making those fiscal decisions kind of on the front lines. Like, is this product, should I keep paying for this product? Is this product doing what it says it does? And that's something where other agencies like NIST have been more active in specific sectors in the past. And personally, would love to see more of that sort of work generally. Because it not only helps us, like I said, figure out what are the right technologies to invest in from a long-term research perspective, but that same data is very helpful for folks kind of at every step of the way as they decide what to spend their energy and funding on.
Yeah, and I have to give a plug to the ARPA-H website. If no one's been to it, ARPA-H.gov, I believe it is. Incredibly well designed and easy to find information, which you often don't find in government websites. So kudos to you and the team. You can find funding information. You can find a lot about the projects there, which is really, I'm happy to see that. Let's get to another topic that Daniel and I have done a couple of webinars on, but I want to hear everyone's opinion on this. This is generative AI, right? And I want to hear from each of you, what's the promise of generative AI in healthcare cybersecurity in particular, right? Should we hope for the world? Should we be completely disappointed? Is it somewhere in between? So Andrew, I want to start with you, because I'm sure you're down into the bits and bytes on this occasionally, but what is your hope for generative AI within the healthcare cybersecurity spectrum?
Even more generally, just the advancements that we've seen across the tech space, but with a lot of that in the AI space. Humans are extremely good at sort of reasoning under uncertainty and making decisions in very complex situations very quickly and optimizing for certain things sort of implicitly. We're not great at managing large amounts of numbers or data or whatnot. And I think sometimes when you look at the processes that we deploy today, we have humans doing a lot of information management and not as much orchestration or actually decision kind of management and being more on the loop rather than in the loop. And I think one of the big opportunities that we're excited to explore here is, can we enable better orchestration of the many technologies that we have at our disposal using sort of the current next generations of AI technology, and really like that to me has been exciting for many years, and sort of to see there was a paper from Microsoft last year about generalized agents for OS tasks in Windows. That was pretty sure it was Microsoft. That was very, very interesting. And the idea that you could have start learning tasks with surprisingly just from passive observation, and then sort of work them into a human's workflow relatively quickly. And I think that to me feels very promising. That feels like a place where we can both leverage this new technology in a useful way and also transition in a way that does not, once again, create friction for the end users, create friction for the systems deploying these at large. That's one of the things I'm very excited about.
Yeah, sorry, stepping there. Great points, right? And we see Shannon in the comments here saying Gen AI should never take away from human interaction or assessment, right? There has to be a balance. And Daniel, I know your team has been doing a good job, one, adopting Gen AI, but balancing it against kind of the human factor of validating what's being found. So can you talk a little bit about the implementations that you've been working on and where that balance has kind of landed?
So the place that we've seen it being very successful, and that kind of meshes a lot with what Andrew was saying, was in our Cynerio Live security analyst team, right? Where they have a lot of information that they have to bring in, whether it's information from vendors about risks that are coming out, information about devices, information about policies, about new vulnerabilities getting pulled out, threat intelligence feeds, right? And this allows them to get a lot of that information in a way that's much more summarized, in a way that's much more actionable, and is able to kind of combine a lot of information from different data sources and basically make them much more efficient and a super powered team for healthcare cybersecurity. And that's something that our customers get direct benefit from. But that's I think a kind of a preamble for what we're going to get in a wider space from a healthcare perspective, in the sense of one of the big challenges, and I think we've talked about it from a number of different directions during this webinar, of a lot of different tools. It's not necessarily connected to what the customers are trying to do, not necessarily clear for the customers how they connect that kind of risk mapping that Russ mentioned to the actual solutions that and stuff that the customer are trying to deploy. How do you do an incident response and go through all that amazing documentation coming out from all the different organizations? There's just too much to do, too much to information to needing to process, and too little time and people to do it. And I think that's where it's going to be very imperative to help, right? Where it's going to be the most effective is you're going to pull in, and that's kind of where we envision it. It's going to pull in all this information from all these different solutions and tools and things that's going on from your network, and say, okay, this is what's going on. These are the things you can do. This is all the information at your fingertips, and just drive you to do that decision that you have to make, pseudo automatically, not whatever it is, but just have that so that you can actually respond quicker, right? Kind of to go back to the beginning of the webinar, responding to the incident response in 2.5 months. No, we need to be able to use technologies like Gen AI to reduce that to days, if not hours, if not minutes.
Yeah, it's almost like efficiency rather than replacement, right? We're not going to remove all the humans. We're just going to make them far more efficient, which is what technology has always done for the history of the world. Now, Russ, I know the CHIME Education Foundation Committee, they're planning an event around Gen AI. There's a short survey going on. I'm really excited to see the results of that. But as you're working with Gen AI, you're looking at the promises in healthcare cybersecurity. What are your thoughts? Where is it going? What should we expect from it?
Yeah, I'll give two answers, and I'll give one that's maybe even a little bit different than what the others gave, a little controversial. I'll start with what's really helpful about Gen AI and AI in general, which is the augmentation of human beings and the ability to get stuff done. Computers are really good at pattern recognition. Humans are not really good at mass pattern recognition. So finding what's changing in systems, pattern recognition. Okay, we may not know what vulnerability just occurred, but we know something happened. That allows somebody like Daniel, allows somebody like Andrew, these really smart security professionals, to go in and target their work. Instead of every day trying to figure out how to secure the entire ecosystem, Let's let them focus on 1, 2, 3, 10 things each day. They will be far more efficient. I think the other side of this, which I'll be a little bit more controversial on, if you look at what the patterns are actually laying out and what's really coming at us from a macro level workforce availability, we are not going to have enough human beings. We're not going to have enough human beings in security, especially for medium and small organizations that can't afford them. So can security be automated? The answer is yes. In many places, security can be augmented, or it can be maximized through sharing in platforms where maybe some of these technologies in some of these places can be shared in local communities, at states, through hospital associations, through different entities. Gen AI and AI at a macro level is going to allow some of this to occur. Maybe some of the jobs, and this is where it can get controversial, maybe some of the jobs that are in health systems today shouldn't exist because technology can replace them, which will allow us to use some of those dollars and some of those resources in a different and more strategic way, which really will help that. We know for a fact there's not going to be enough nurses. There's not going to be enough doctors. There's not going to be enough security professionals as we move forward. Not just in the US, globally, there's not going to be enough people to do the jobs necessary. AI probably serves as a major opportunity to think about the automation and the replacement of human labor, as well as, in some cases, even positions to allow us to be more effective, especially with cybersecurity.
Yeah, and to hammer on that point, depending on the study you look at, there's somewhere between 3 and 4 million open cybersecurity jobs today. That number is only going to grow, and we're not going to be able to keep up with the pace of training to fill that. So we've got about 8 minutes left. Got some good questions coming in. Audience, if you have other questions, now's the time to ask them. But I want to wrap it up with this because we've painted a picture of what's happening. We've talked about a lot of resources out there. But the number one thing we have to focus on is prioritization. What specific action should people take this afternoon, tomorrow, this month? So Russ, I'll start with you. What 3 activities do you recommend to your peers and your CHIME members take immediately in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, mine's going to be a pretty high level strategic, and that is first and foremost a real risk assessment done by real risk cybersecurity experts out there that really can understand what your risks are, what those risks mean from an outcome, whether that be heat map or whatever, prioritizing, and really map that into the strategic planning process from the board down of what your priorities should be, where you should be making your investments. You are never going to be secure. So the question is, how do I make myself as secure as possible based on prioritization? And that starts with a good risk assessment. I think the second part of this is organizational education, which is starting at a board level, starting at the highest levels in the organization, truly understanding what the risk modeling should be, helping them make really good decisions on what our priorities should be, and allowing certain governance to occur outside the traditional security or technology departments, and let that be owned at that level of fiduciary responsibility. And the part right now, unfortunately, which I would really recommend, is a really well-practiced, well-oiled response plan right now, an incident response plan. The odds are everybody's going to have some security vulnerability occur at some point in the near future. The question is, are you ready to react up to an extreme perspective, if necessary, to including all the organizational things that you should be dealing with, like public opinion and PR and all those kinds of things, never mind just the technology part. I'd love to tell you make huge investments, but at least approach from a platform perspective what your overall investment strategy should be based on those 3 things.
Cool, great. And if you didn't catch those 3 things, they're getting a real risk assessment, having situational education from the top down, and getting a well-practiced incident response plan. The third one I think is great because when your laptop goes down, your phone might be encrypted. Who do you call? If you don't have that on a sheet of paper in your drawer, you may be lost. Daniel, I'll ask you the same question. What 3 things should people come out of today with actions to take away?
So I'm going to have to steal one of Russ's. I'm sorry, but the third one, it just hit the nail on the head, I think, from my perspective, at least, that the incident response, that's something that I see as being the most critical. Everything else is a project. Everything else is something that takes time to reach. It's like time to protect. That is something that every and any organization can do today at some level to significantly improve their ability to handle risk. So having a incident response solution, having the second thing would be kind of a continuation. It would be ownership around it. There has to be clear understanding of ownership in the organization. The places that we've worked with, the organizations that we've seen have struggled with incident response. One of the main problems was around unclear ownership. Is there different people responsible for incident response and different types of devices? How do you know who the device owner is, whether it's in a building management system or a medical device or radiology device or a server, a cloud solution being used, whatever it is? There has to be understanding not only from the security ownership, but also from the ownership from the people who it's critical from an operational perspective or from a confidentiality perspective, and who that person is in the organization. And the third piece is around, again, kind of Russ mentioned it, so I'll copy that as well, around kind of practicing it, making sure that the organization knows and has it in a well-practiced, well-versed way, so that when that happens, the organization knows how to handle it. It's true for other things as well, not just for incident response, also for handling risk, handling new devices coming in, everything else from cybersecurity. But this is a place where, as you mentioned, Chad, it's critical to be able to actually handle it when these attacks happen.
Yeah, numerous corners of hospitals operate on checklists and being well practiced, right? You go to an emergency room, there are clear flows that you follow. We need to do the same thing in cybersecurity. So clear ownership. Daniel, to that point, we did a survey with the Ponymon Institute about 1.5 years ago. 8% of those respondents said that nurses should be responsible for cybersecurity. I'm sure they're perfectly capable. They should be responsible for saving lives and treating patients, not cybersecurity. So ownership is critical. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you. 3 takeaways everyone should look into today.
The first one is it's very hard to secure or improve an environment that you don't understand really comprehensively. So I would encourage folks, regardless of the level that they're at, whether it's an executive or sort of on an active, response team, find a person that you don't talk to normally, that's not in a role that you understand, or that's in a different vertical. Spend more time talking to that person, whoever it is. And once you find that one person, find 2 more different people in other roles and do that 2 more times. I cannot overstate the value of getting better situational awareness across the entire ecosystem, a better holistic view of what your facility or institution needs to be doing, so that when you deploy solutions, when you pick vendors, that you are picking things that fit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that example, we like to call it the HTM IT pizza party, right? Where HTM is in charge of maintaining all the devices. IT is making sure the network stays up. There can be some natural conflict. You get them in a room, you have a pizza party every month. Things get a little bit easier when you do that. So that communication is critical. Gentlemen, appreciate your time today. It looks like we've hit on, we have one more question that came in. It's more of a comment. Healthcare is going to be forced to report, much like we're seeing publicly traded organizations. Sandra, I think that's a great observation, right? We're seeing regulation in almost every other industry around cybersecurity. It is coming to healthcare. With that said, Russ, Daniel, Andrew, huge thanks for, we have one more, sorry, just under the wire. How do executives ensure that guidance from the IT team is enough? And Russ, I'm going to toss this to you because I think it's more that it's a top-down than a bottom-up approach. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Part of that is dual education, both from the bottom up, but also from the top down. And what we're starting to see is many boards in the United States, especially many boards in the United States, are placing a person on there that has a least technology background, if not a cyber background. In the case of the board that I am on, we actually have a separate technology board, which half of that board is made up of security professionals. I'm not counting myself as a security professional. These are people that live this every day in the industry. And I will tell you that it is a great representation because they are called on, not the security department, not the CISO. They are called upon when the corporate board says, why do we need to make these investments? Why do we have still risk? And so part of this is the ownership that I think Daniel was talking about, which is where does ownership reside and how does it reside within an organization? Then there's the professionals that actually have to operationalize this and really help those organizations be successful.
Great stuff. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Russ, Daniel, Andrew, great answers. Audience, great interaction. I love to see an engaged audience like this, so thank you for your comments and questions. We do have a few other links and comments in the chat if you want to see some of our previous webinars or articles that were referenced. So feel free to reach out, chad.holmes@cynerio.com or www.cynerio.com, and we'll be happy to help you out. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you very much.